and welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, PhD equine nutritionist, lover of the science of nutrition, and patient owner of multiple easy keepers. These horses that seem to stay fat if they are just in view of pasture or hay. And over the years, I have utilised many different methods of trying to keep their weight under control. We've gone through nearly every brand of grazing muzzle there is on the market. We have used different types of pasture species. We've used different forms of pasture restriction. But in recent years, I have been using a combination of track and strip grazing. And it has changed their lives. It has changed my life. They are happier horses. Their weight is, I'd love to say completely under control, but their weight is way more under control than what it ever used to be. So I do manage over winter to get them back to where you can feel their ribs really easily. Come springtime, which we are in the Southern Hemisphere in the middle of as I record this, they seem to put on weight so quickly, but they're starting from a condition score of around 5 from the end of winter. So previously I struggled to get weight off them over winter, and then we would get to spring and they would get even fatter than they already were. About, I'm going to say 10 years ago, I ended up with 3 horses, all with laminitis in the middle of summer. Completely took me by surprise. There is a podcast on the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast devoted to laminitis where I tell that story. So if you're interested in that, you can go and read that. But their obesity was a big factor in that. And that was what really gave me a kick up the bum, I guess, in not being, I don't know what the word is, maybe like an ostrich, I was sticking my head in the sand, particularly with my gelding. I thought he wasn't going to be prone to laminitis. His mother never had laminitis. It wasn't, I thought, in his genetics, and I had let him get quite overweight, thinking, well, he's fat, but he's happy. But wrong call, no way to learn like having a horse that has got very sore feet and feeling horribly guilty that it is my profession to prevent these diseases in horses, and I'd let it happen to my own horse. But so I've been much more vigilant since then in needing to keep weight off, and this track system and strip grazing has just been a game changer. So today's podcast, I want to talk about strip grazing well, because there's different ways you can do strip grazing, and I think there's a few little things that I've sort of learnt, and also there's lots of really nice research that we will have a bit of a chat about as well, and I will put the links to the research papers I mentioned during this podcast in the show notes. So if you're interested in going and reading the abstracts, and some of them are also open access, so you can read the entire paper, I will put that there in the show notes for you so you can chase them up. So the reason we strip graze horses is to restrict their pasture intake. So for strip grazing, I'm sure nearly all of you are going to be familiar. There is what we call a front fence or a lead fence, which is usually just a piece of electric wire or electric tape across a paddock, usually with just little push posts or insulated pigtail posts into the ground. That front fence is the fence that we move on a semi-regular basis. It doesn't need to be daily. It might be every 2 or 3 days, just depending on the situation for your horses and what your grass is doing. And we'll go over the finer details of that in a second. So we have a front or lead fence that we move to give the horses access to fresh pasture. And then you may or may not use a back fence. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, is whether or not you should use a back fence and what the benefits are of having a back fence. So let's just talk quickly, or have a look quickly at what the research says at what using strip grazing does for our horses. So there's a lovely paper by Annette Longland et al. Published in 2022 that showed that ponies, so they had 2 pasture areas, and they either gave ponies free access to one of the areas or they strip grazed the other area. Actually, there might have been 3 areas, because there was one strip grazing where they used just a lead fence and another where they used both a lead or front fence and also a back fence. And what they found in that study was that the ponies that had free access to pasture, they were not strip grazed, their body weight increased 5% over I think it was only 28 days. It was at 28 days. So they had a 5% increase in body weight over 28 days in ponies that were allowed free access to this pasture. Yet the ponies that were strip grazed still increased their body weight. So it was an English study, and I'm going to make the assumption that the pasture was quite high in nutrient value. So even when they strip grazed these ponies, they still had an increase in body weight, but it was much smaller. So it was between 1.2 and 1.6% body weight that they increased in 28 days when they were strip grazed. Those same authors published another paper in 2023. I think it would have been data from the same study, so the same setup where there was some horses that were allowed free access to the pasture and others that were strip grazed either with just a lead fence or with a lead and a back fence. And in that paper, they described that the ponies with free access to the pasture exceeded their energy intake by 48%. So they were eating way more than they needed to on these beautiful pastures that were not what was intended for a pony to ever eat throughout evolution. But when they strip grazed them, their energy intake was only exceeded by 8%. So it has got really, really good potential for reducing energy intake and therefore limiting unwanted body weight gain. So this is all with the aim of doing exactly that, reducing their energy intake and stopping them from getting too overweight. And of course, when they do get really overweight, they're much more prone to things like metabolic syndrome and insulin dysregulation, which then puts them at really high risk of laminitis. And we really want to avoid laminitis at all cost where we can. And so strip grazing does become a really, really handy tool for preventing laminitis in horses. There's another paper by Roxanne Curtin et al., only published this year, so being recorded in 2025, and this paper was published in May of 2025, and it was looking at the impact of restricted grazing on both the behaviour and the welfare of, I think it was ponies again, and the comparison between a track system where they're able to move a little more freely and strip grazing. And what they found was that ponies moved more when they were on the track versus the strip grazing. And they also had less social conflicts on the track. And that's where I think I've just inadvertently, it wasn't through any scientific, wasn't following any, well, that paper was only published this year, but it was through luck more than anything that the way my pastures and property is set up, what I've ended up with, which is ideal, is I have 2 pastures that I can strip graze my horses on. But then to get between water and the pasture, for one of the strip grazing paddocks, they have to move along a track that is nearly 1 kilometre long. So I can force, for want of a better word, my horses to travel. In reality, what I'm really creating is a much more natural environment where they are moving from their water source out to feed, and then they'll come back to their water source, which is exactly what they would do in the wild. When water is reasonably restricted, they would move from a water source out to feed and then come back to the water source. So they're moving quite a lot, and they are happier horses. There's 7 of them here. 5 of them are in the track and being strip grazed. And they operate like a happy little herd. There's definitely the dominant ones and the submissive ones, but they do seem to all be content. They're less anxious than they used to be, would be an observation that I've made since they've been in the track and strip grazing. So it's nice when observation in the real world actually agrees with what is being written and published in the science. So strip grazing it's a little bit of an art, to be honest. And I was thinking about this. I was pottering around here doing some things, just doing some jobs before I sat down to record this podcast. And And I was thinking it would be really nice if there was some sort of a formula. You move your fence. If it's this long, then move it by this many meters, and that will give this many horses this many hours of grazing. But it just doesn't work like that. And in fact, even in your own pastures, once you get to know your own pastures, if you start to strip graze, depending on the climate and the amount of pasture in the season, you will move your fence differently. So let me give you some concrete examples of this. In early spring, when my pastures are bright, lush green, there's typically nearly always some dry standing grass in my pastures because they never really get fully eaten down. But the most palatable grass, and the grass that the horses are really seeking out, is bright green, lush. And in springtime, it will accumulate non-structural carbohydrate during the day. And because a couple of my horses have had laminitis in the past, I still have 2 of those horses from 10 years ago, I am really, really conscious of making sure that I limit their non-structural carbohydrate intake so that I don't trigger their laminitis, which means in spring, when I move their fence, I want to move it really early in the morning, like as early as possible, because that's when pastures are lowest in non-structural carbohydrate. And again, I explain this a lot more in the podcast about laminitis. So if you want to know more about pasture and grazing and keeping laminitic horses safe, please go and have a listen to that episode. But in springtime, I will move the fence very, very early, and I will only move it far enough that the horses have pretty much finished eating most of the lush green grass within a couple of hours of me moving the fence, so that they're not eating a lot of green, high non-structural carbohydrate pastures later in the day. And I will restrict it even more if we end up in one of those periods where we have very cold nights. So we will still dip below freezing overnight where I am. But then the days are longer and bright and sunny, typically in our springtime. So if we have a run of those climate conditions, I'm really conscious of not moving the fence too far, because the pasture will likely be accumulating non-structural carbohydrate and getting more and more dangerous for the laminitis-prone horses in that period of time. And in fact, sometimes I'll go, you know what, we've had 5 nights now of below freezing temperatures and bright sunny days, and it worries me so much that I won't move their fence on those days, and instead I will give them access to a hay that I have here, or hays that I have, and I'll typically also have straw out for them to eat. And I will come back to the straw thing soon. But then later on in spring, so say for example now we are looking at getting up to close to 40 degrees Celsius, which I believe, I'm very bad at converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, but I believe is around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If I was more clever, I'd Google it while I was talking, but I can't do that. It's hot, and it hasn't rained for maybe 3 weeks, and so our ground is getting very, very dry, and our pastures are drying off really quickly. And I wouldn't be surprised if after 2 or 3 days of this really hot weather, the pastures that we have that are currently still reasonably green will be quite dried off and getting quite brown. So once my pastures dry off, the energy content is lower, the protein content is lower, the risk of non-structural carbohydrate accumulation now in later spring is also much lower, because our overnight temperatures are quite high. So the plants are staying nice and warm, and they will be metabolizing the carbohydrates that they make during the day to grow and reproduce. And they're also heading very much into late reproductive stage now, which happens so quickly. It sort of catches you off guard, and how quickly they go from that late vegetative stage through to late reproductive stage when a bit of hot weather comes along in my particular climate. But because they're more mature and they've got less nutrient content, then my strips start to get a little bit bigger. So I'm not so worried about them finishing all the grass within a couple of hours after sunrise for laminitis prevention. And I'm also able to give them a little bit more grass because it's lower in energy and it's less likely to exceed their energy content. So I'll move the fence a little more. I still will move it for a period of time daily. And then as spring progresses, and in fact I'm in this stage now, I'll move it maybe every 2 or 3 days, because there's not a lot of lush green pasture in it anymore. They'll eat the more palatable plants typically first, but then it's becoming quite stemmy and stalky. So they're able to eat that much lower energy, lower protein grass, the stemmy stalky stuff, over a few days, and then I'll give them, I'll move their lead fence again so that they get fresh pasture. And in summer, depending on whether it's rained, and this is why, how far do you move your strip grazing fence? Well, how long is a piece of string? It depends on so many factors. It depends on how wide your pasture is. It depends on how many horses you have in the pasture and therefore how much grass they're going to consume. But later in summer, if it doesn't rain much and it's quite a dry summer, then my pastures are typically brown. There's virtually no green. There might be a little bit of paspalum in them. And I will go out and move. It's quite a job moving the fence in summer because the ground gets really hard and it's much harder to push the posts in. But I will go out and give them 4 or 5 days worth of pasture at one time, because the pastures are so low in nutrients by that stage. They're really low in energy, really low in protein. And it means that it's almost like feeding them straw, and they can eat as much of that as they like. So I will move the fence and give them 4 or 5 days worth, but I still strip graze them. So there's virtually never a time when I just give my horses on the tracks and strips, I call it. So on the track and strip system, there's virtually never a time where I'll give them free access to one of the pastures, because what they'll do is they will go through and pick out all of the good stuff. And so for that period of time, they probably will gain weight because they've got that ability to go through and selectively eat the best quality, the leafiest plants and the best quality plants that they can find. And then they'll leave all of the really rough stuff right to the end that they don't really want to eat. So in still strip grazing them, even though I'm only moving the fence every 4 or 5 days, I'm essentially making them eat everything that's in that pasture, in that strip, and preventing them from going and selecting out the good stuff and leaving the stuff that they don't like. So it really, how much and how often you move your fence really, really depends on what you're trying to achieve. It really depends on how young and high in energy and protein your pastures are, and therefore how much you need to restrict your horses' pasture intake to control their body condition. And like I said, it depends how many horses are in the strip and how quickly they will eat the amount of grass that you are giving them as well. In fact, I've just experienced that with my little crew. I have gone from having 4 of the bigger horses in the tracks and strips, and Domino, my gorgeous little paint, ended up with some mud fever on one of her legs because there's a gully that they have to cross, and it had been so wet in late winter and early spring that our groundwater must be just really filled up, and this gully hasn't drained away. So walking through this muddy water every day, and she's got these gorgeous big white stockings up over her knees on all 4 legs, and being that sort of more fragile pink skin, she ended up with mud fever. So I've had her out of the tracks and strips, and her sister Dellinger has been out keeping her company. So I've gone down to 2 horses just momentarily, and it was that thing of like, I went to move Poet and Popcorn's fence. I went, you've still got lots of grass. Okay, I won't move it for you, because I'd given them enough. In my mind, I'd sort of calibrated for 4 horses, and I'd given them enough that when I went to move it about 2 days later, they still had plenty of grass there. So you can definitely just play it by ear. You can watch and see how much grass they've got available. You can watch their body condition and adjust how much you're giving them. So if they're maintaining beautifully on the amount that you give them, then you're probably giving them the right amount. If they're losing weight, which would be amazing if they're good, easy keepers, but if you don't want them to lose weight, then give them some more. If they're gaining too much weight, then give them less. I mentioned straw earlier, and I find straw is really, really handy when you are strip grazing horses, especially when the pasture is really high quality. So in springtime, I will nearly always have straw out for my horses, because it means that I can give them their daily allocation of strip. So I'll move their strip grazing fence, and they can have their pasture very early in the morning. But then when they've finished that pasture, that they do have little bits and pieces they can nibble on. Their track is nearly always covered, but it's so overgrazed that they're not getting much from the track. So they can munch on that. But when I am really restricting the amount of grass I'm giving them on their strip because I'm worried about laminitis, I'll leave straw out for them, an abundant amount of straw. They can eat as much of it as they like. And it just means that if they're looking for something to chew on to, buffer their stomach and prevent gastric ulceration, and just because they're wired to chew, I mean, they're always looking for something to chew on because that's how they've been wired up through their 55 million years of evolution. Putting straw out means for good doers, you are giving them something to chew on, but it's so low in calorie intake that it's not going to contribute to an obesity problem. So it's a brilliant tool to use if you can find good quality straw. Just have it out for them, and that means that once they've finished their grass from the strip that you've given them, they can come back, and I usually put it near a water source, the straw, so they can come back to their water, have a drink if they need a drink, and then they can chew on straw for the day. So the research that Annette Longland and her co-authors didn't show that using a back fence actually reduced their energy intake or their body weight gain any more than just having a lead fence. But I still think that I always use a back fence, and I still think there's justification for using a back fence for a few reasons. So when you put a back fence, what it does is stop your horses from grazing back over the areas that you've already given them access to. So if you imagine the easiest shaped paddock to strip graze is just a rectangle, and you will have your lead fence all the way across from one side of the rectangle to the other. And each day you will go out and move at least part of that fence, and you don't have to have your fences straight. I did work experience when I was an undergrad student at university. I studied rural science, and part of our degree was 26 weeks of work experience, and we had to do work experience across a diverse range of animal industries. So I went and also agronomy, but I went and did work experience on a friend's dairy farm, and every morning, as a joke, it was all very good humoured and lots of fun. But every morning, the straightness of my strip grazing fence, because they would strip graze their dairy cows, the straightness of my fence would be assessed, and man, I learned to make straight fences when I was doing work experience and moving, because the first few days my fences were terribly wobbly, but I learnt exactly how to line up the fence posts so that they were nice and straight. But you don't need to have straight strip grazing fences, and often I will only move one or two posts each day, so it's almost like I give them a triangle shaped piece of pasture as opposed to a straight line right across. If you are OCD and you need to have your fences straight, that's fine. You can do that, but don't feel like you have to have a dead straight strip grazing fence, and don't feel like you have to move every post every day either. You can just move one or two posts if that's enough to give your horses enough pasture. But so the lead fence moves along on giving your horse access to the new pasture, and then the back fence it obviously needs to have a laneway to allow them to get up past the back fence and onto the fresh bits of pasture. But the back fence stops them from grazing over the areas that you've already given them access to. And I think on big pastures, so the pastures that the research was done on that showed they didn't see any difference when a back fence was used, those pastures were quite small. I'm just trying to scan to see if I can see the actual sizes, but they were reasonably small pastures, which means that the area that they'd already grazed is also reasonably small. But when you're grazing bigger pastures, if you're strip grazing bigger pastures, the area becomes quite large, and that grass, if the grass is still growing, so it's not as applicable if it's very dry and your grasses aren't growing, but when grasses are still growing, you're using strip grazing to restrict pasture intake. But if you're not using a back fence, they will be able to graze quite a bit of grass from those areas that will start to grow back after they've been grazed over the first time. So a back fence to me is just, it's extra control of their pasture intake. And I see with my pastures, and particularly in springtime, the amount of grass that grows in that back fence area is amazing. Like, it grows back so quickly when you don't let the horses eat it right down to the ground. And so if you imagine that you weren't back fencing, they would be getting a portion of that. So they're not going to be eating as much pasture as what you see grow back, because the plants take a little while to get leaf area back again. And then once they've got some leaf area, they can grow a lot faster. So obviously if they're being grazed all the time, that's not going to be happening, but they'll still be getting additional pasture from those areas if you don't back fence them. But I think maybe the biggest advantage of using a back fence is that you're protecting your pastures. So you're not allowing your horses to absolutely hammer, particularly the species that they really like to eat. So if you're fencing them off the areas that they've already grazed and stopping them from going over and over and over again and grazing those areas, you're protecting your preferred species, and you're keeping ground cover there so that you're getting less weeds growing, and you're also giving yourself more of a pasture resource. So I have had it in certain seasons that I'll graze from one side of a pasture to the other, and by the time they've gotten right to the end, there's enough grass behind the back fence to start strip grazing that same paddock again. Whereas if I hadn't back fenced that paddock, they would have kept that entire paddock eaten down, like in an overgrazed state, and I wouldn't have had that pasture resource to go back over and use again. So a back fence, I think a back fence is really important. You do need to get a little bit creative sometimes in how you're going to back fence, because you do have to create them a laneway that they can travel up to get to the fresh areas of grazing every day. So it might be that you have to sit down with a pencil and a bit of paper and scribble out, here's the trough, here's the front fence. How do I get them from, the trough? Because they always obviously need to have access to water as well. How do you set it up? I strip graze a one wild shaped pasture. It's a big fat L shape and it's got trees all through it. So it's, a matter of having to move the fence. I need to come up with some fancy system of strip grazing in paddocks with trees, because you have to get around the trees to move your fence. But it's all possible. And honestly, it's such an effective way of restricting their pasture intake. And I love grazing muzzles. I think grazing muzzles definitely have a place for many horses. And gosh, they saved me a lot of times when I had to restrict pasture intake and get horses to lose weight, but didn't have a track system set up. So I didn't want to restrict their movement too much. So I was able to use grazing muzzles to let them graze over a reasonably large area, but have their pasture intake restricted enough. But I just found in summer, like, it does get very hot in our summers, and and it may be just me being human about it, but having a grazing muzzle on over their nose in those really 40-degree plus days, I didn't like the thought of that. And Popcorn, our little Australian stock horse, she actually started wearing her teeth away. So her front incisors, because she grazed so hard on that grazing muzzle, she was so diligent at grazing through her grazing muzzle, her front incisors, her incisors started wearing away. And I mean, they've grown back and worn back down normally now, luckily, but I had to stop using a grazing muzzle with her because she was going to wear them down to the point where she would get into the soft and painful bits, and that wasn't going to end well. So strip grazing for me has just gotten around so many little issues like that. And I do think the horses, particularly when I've combined the track, so if you can figure out a way to combine a track system with a strip grazing system where you are making your horses move from water along a track to get out to their strip grazing and then back along the track to get back to water, it means that they're moving, they're burning calories, they've got opportunity to gallop. So my horses you'll often hear them thundering up of an evening when they come up to get their balance and pellet and bits and pieces that they get in their hard feed. But it means that they're galloping and they're maintaining their bone strength as well, which is really important for me. I love to hear my horses gallop. Thank you, Dr. Brian Nielsen, for all your research in that area. And there is a podcast with Brian on that exact topic of how important it is for horses to move and to have access to free exercise so that they can maintain their bone strength. So for all of those reasons, it's so good for their joints. Moves a lot of nutrient through their joint when they're moving around. So it's so good for a lot of reasons for them to be moving. So if you can figure out Get creative with it's all of mine is just done with electric tape. Get creative with how you can set up your pastures and really think about whether you can actually have some sort of strip grazing and track system. I mean, you could even put a track all the way around the perimeter of your horse's paddock, and then have an opening and strip graze them in the middle of the paddock and set it up so that they have to go along the track to get to water and then back along the track to get back to feed. I'm sure there's lots of creative ways you can do it. I will leave you to figure out for your exact pasture size and paddock setup and water setup how you might be able to do that. If you want to run any ideas by us, I'd be super happy to have a look at strip grazing setups. We do have, for our members of the Happy Horse Nutrition app, we do have an open Zoom room. Details are inside the app. So that's the sort of thing that if you bring to the open Zoom room, I'd be really happy to help you figure out how to set up your horse's strip grazing systems. So I hope that's helpful. Like I said, there's so many variables in setting up a strip grazing system, but you really can't. It's a matter of just be brave and experiment. And use your horse's body condition and their digital pulse in spring if they're at laminitis risk. And again, go and listen to the laminitis podcast if that is your situation. But use what your horse is showing you and telling you to know whether you're doing it right. And do be conscious. One last little thing I will mention: do be conscious of their stomach that is secreting acid 24/7. So don't restrict them so severely with strip grazing that you're leaving them for large periods of time without anything to chew on. And this is where I was saying straw for very overweight horses, or if you're using strip grazing just to look after your pastures and you've got performance horses that have got higher energy needs, you can put out abundant amounts of high quality hay so they have their pasture when they strip graze, and then they can come back and munch on hay for the rest of the day. Just don't ever leave them for longer than 4 hours without forage to chew on, because you massively increase their risk of gastric ulceration, and it's something you want to try and avoid at all costs for their sake. Yeah, that's it. I love strip grazing. Give it a go, and if you get stuck, jump into the app and join one of our Zoom rooms and we'll help you figure out how you can achieve it. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.